All right.
You're live.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first installment of our FIU School of Architecture 2020-2021 Decolonizing Design Lecture Series for the spring semester. Today's topic is Design for Collective Wellbeing, and it's the first of three this semester. The second one will be on February 23rd, The Activist Architects, and the third one is on March 23rd on Alternative Professional Paths. So we hope that you'll join us for that too. Our moderator today is Robert Cohen. He will introduce the speakers, but I wanted to take a moment to welcome everybody, as well as introduce Robert himself, whom you might know as one of our 2020 Masters in Landscape Architecture grads, but perhaps don't realize how ideal his background is for such an important topic as the one we're tackling today. I think as designers, we often talk about working or our ability to navigate and operate at the intersection of things. In Robert's case, he came to us from Northeastern University with a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry, start counting, a minor in biology, and a concentration in art history.
Roberto, you were just muted.
Okay, hopefully I wasn't muted for the beginning. Okay, so I'll back up maybe a little bit. So I was just saying that we often talk about our ability to navigate and operate at the intersection of things as designers. But in Robert's case, he came to us from Northeastern with a Bachelor in Science in Chemistry, a minor in Biology, and a concentration in art history. And throughout his time at FIU, this background, I think, really helped shape many of the conversations and the projects he took on. And not only did he excel in his coursework and demonstrated his ability to synthesize knowledge in urban planning and ecology and environment, but he was also an active student leader that took on difficult, I think, topics. And that led to his being selected as our Olmsted Scholar, this very prestigious thing from the Landscape Architecture Foundation that recognizes achievement, but also the potential to influence the future of the landscape architecture discipline. And so, as Robert likes to say, he bridges the gap between knowledge and action, to which I'll say he does that very, very well. And his current research is a proof of that. He's collaborating with medical professionals at FIU's Herbert Wertheim School of Medicine and UM's Miller School of Medicine, and helping to discover new correlations between the design of public space and the transmission of COVID-19, looking at streets, looking at transportation hubs in particular. As a scientist, he is a scientist, he can say that, and as a landscape designer who himself is a person with type 1 diabetes, he's a person who sees the exponential power that creating connections between disparate things or things that you might not consider to be that related or compatible, novel information, design, disability, disease. He brings these things together, and he brings people together in unlikely collaborators possibly to creatively address challenges like the ones that we're talking about today. I can't think of a more qualified person to lead the discussion than Robert, so take it over, Robert.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Roberto. And thank you, Mars Tagaru, for inviting me, and Mariana Boldu for co-organizing this with me. I invited all of our speakers today because everybody has sort of a unique perspective on providing health and well-being through public space, whether that's through technical expertise in the face of climate change, whether it's disability representation in practice. And thank you, Mars Tagaru, for inviting me and organizing this with me. If you can, please mute your microphone because I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I invited all of our speakers. Thank you. So all of our speakers today have a very unique perspective on public health and how design can influence that, whether it's through technical expertise against climate change, whether it's bringing representation of disabled people into design practice, or whether it's collaborating between direct healthcare and scientific professionals and the design disciplines. So our three speakers today are Mariana Boldu, Alexa von Brainerd, and Eric Helm. Mariana Boldu is the Director of Resilience Design at Curtis & Rogers and brings 28 years of international practice to her firm. She holds a graduate degree in architecture from the University of Cordoba a Master's of Landscape Architecture from the College of Environmental Science and Forestry, SUNY, and has done PhD courses in sustainable design at the Polytechnic University of Catalunya. She's registered as a landscape architect in Florida and Colorado. She is registered as a LEED accredited professional, member of ASLA, and Water Edge Design Guidelines professional. So she has experience in urban design, architecture, and landscape architecture. She is a board member of the Sea Level Rise Committee for the City of Miami, and was a major part of bringing this to become the Climate Resiliency Committee. She shared a wonderful quote with us: "An ounce of practice is worth more than a ton of preaching." Alexa Von Brainerd is a deaf landscape architect in Olin's LA office. She's a 2018 Olmsted Scholar and a 2020 LAF Olmsted Fellow. She's a two-time alumna of the University of California, Berkeley, and holds both a BA and an MLA in landscape architecture from her alma mater. So her research began with the focus on designing for the deaf community, and she's now exploring methods to better include the greater disabled community as stakeholders and experts in the design process. With a living toolkit for landscape architects and planners to be released later this year, she has served as an advisor to the ASLA Universal Design Guide and is actively working at Olin's People's Lab. Her work in Deafscape, applying Deafscape to landscape, was originally published in the Ground Up Journal. It has been widely featured. I had the pleasure of meeting Alexa Von Brainerd at the Cut and Fill Unconference in Landscape Architecture by Urban Studio, where we had the opportunity to speak openly about our experiences as designers in this industry, as designers in this education process, and just as everyday users of public space. So thank you to Cut and Fill for bringing us together. Now, Eric is sort of a special person here today because he is not a landscape architect or in the design field, but he's a third-year medical student at FIU's Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine. So his goal is to expand the vast resources that healthcare has to offer beyond the walls of the hospital and into the rhythm of community life, as he calls it. He served as the co-president of FIU's White Coats for Black Lives chapter, and he's organized with Black leaders such as the Southern Birth Justice Network and the Magnolia Birth House to promote racial and reproductive justice and Black maternal wellness. He's joined forces with medical students at UM and Southeastern University to organize around human trafficking and its many intersectional relationships with racism, misogyny, housing and healthcare, generational trauma, and other social issues. And he was a co-author on a project that he and I will be presenting today called Beyond the Distance. Eric is a Florida resident himself and feels right at home amongst landscape architects and frequently spends his time on trails and appreciating manatees from a kayak. So thank you, Eric, for joining us today. So we're going to hop right in, and we're going to begin with 3 presentations by all of our panelists today. And after that, we're going to have a moderated panel in which I'm going to ask everybody some similar questions around some same themes, but from their different perspectives. And as long as we have time, at the end, we're going to have some time for student questions as well. So Eric, if you can please unmute yourself. I'm going to start screen sharing so we can begin our presentation. Okay, ready, Eric?
Ready.
Okay, awesome. So our project is called Beyond the Distance, promoting respiratory resilience through dynamic motion in city streets. So this project began last year, right after finishing my capstone, when we were both really worried about the response to scientific guidance in responding to this pandemic. We saw a lot of projects about public space, engaging with social distancing, but the depth of relationship did not go much further than that. This dialogue missed critical components of how coronavirus and other diseases that spread through respiratory droplets are spread in public space. And by just focusing on social distancing, we also created sort of this epidemic of urban loneliness, asking people to isolate without the opportunity to engage with others. I personally felt this as someone who has type 1 diabetes and is higher risk. Living in Sweetwater during my last semester at FIU, I felt very trapped indoors. There was no safe public space where I could distance myself from others. There was nowhere in my building beyond my apartment that I could go to. And it really wasn't even safe to ride the elevator because of the way this disease was spread. So I reached out to Eric as someone who has worked with me on projects about misinformation in the past and asked him if he'd like to collaborate on this. And this is the resulting research that came out of that.
Yeah, so when he reached out, I was obviously, of course, immediately interested. And one of the first things we noticed was there was a huge amount of misinformation spreading about the pandemic and how the virus could or could not be transmitted. And then we also noticed this one-size-fits-all approach of like wear a mask and social distancing. And that really lacks some of the nuance that could adequately balance the competing needs of the community. So we've seen throughout the pandemic, like obviously through the very necessary attempt to reduce the spread of the virus, we've sacrificed mental health, we've sacrificed normal primary care visits, a lot of things that are very important and that we need design to help meet. So we turned to the emerging research that we could find to see if design could add a layer of nuance back to the equation. And this slide here, one of the first things we found was, so this diagram is representing a study that was outlining how COVID could spread in one particular restaurant. So this was an epidemiologic case study. And there's one infected person sitting at a table on the path of an air conditioner. And that spread the virus to nearly 50% of the people who were sitting within the same path of that air conditioner. But the wait staff who broke that 6 feet rule, who moved in through that, who broke that social distance bubble, didn't get infected with COVID-19. And diners, the reason for this was because diners downstream accumulated a greater number of viral particles over time, while the waiter who just went in for a brief moment didn't accumulate that key infective dose to actually become infected with COVID-19. So consequently, we thought of the idea of promoting dynamic motion in outdoor public spaces could potentially protect more people from COVID-19 than merely the social distancing alone.
And this is something that we went on to explore in outdoor space for public space, but this is something incredibly relevant to interior architects, working in restaurants, working in medical situations, hospitality, and architects in general. So we went on to see what other people were doing in response to this, and we saw a lot of these social distancing circles popping up in parks around the country. But we found it to be quite problematic because even if you're physically distancing, if you're congregating for a long period of time without moving, you're going to accumulate those particles from someone downstream, just 6 feet away from you, as long as that air is consistently flowing in one direction. So you can see here on the bottom right, a diagram created by another designer showing a categorization of risk. So we sort of started to see these troublesome conflicts that were popping up. So we need to promote dynamic motion and discourage congregation to protect the public from respiratory infectious disease. But we also know that the right to peaceful assembly is fundamental for a vibrant civic life and a healthy democracy. We can't just have people moving along. So we looked out to investigate how can landscape architecture reconcile streets' conflicting roles as congregational civic spaces and public spaces that can enable us to have physical distancing and dynamic motion to protect our citizens from respiratory outbreaks like COVID-19.
So one of the first things we had to do was pick a site where we wanted to, base this investigation. And, we thought about, other neighborhoods in Miami. We thought about Boston, where we both spent, a couple years of our life. But at the time, we both are attending FIU and we both lived in Sweetwater. So why look any further than outside your front door? And Sweetwater actually fit perfectly because it's almost a microcosm of the entire surrounding of Miami. So like the city of Miami, Sweetwater has a 67% park deficit per capita. It lacks the public space that is needed to safely participate in social distancing and dynamic motion. Its citizens are also largely immigrants, very similar to that of Miami. It's 97% Hispanic. The median income is $36,000 per year. And many of the people who work in Sweetwater are essential workers, are the people stocking the grocery stores, are the people delivering the Amazon packages, and are the people most likely to be infected with COVID-19. It also comes with all the same racism and socioeconomic disparities and all the health disparities that come along with that, which has resulted in Hispanic populations being 4.1 times more likely to be hospitalized from COVID-19 than their white counterparts, with a 3.8 times greater risk of death from this disease, which again highlights the need to design specifically for communities where it's most needed. So we went around Sweetwater and we identified, the barriers that we could see. So barriers included, pedestrian mobility was with limited access to education, to food, to medicine, transportation, and recreation also being vitally important. There's excessive heat. There's flooding in the streets after just any normal rain, dangerous car-oriented streets, and a lack of play space. Daily use of public space was incredibly difficult, is what we could see. And that was with or without, the conflicting needs of a respiratory pandemic.
So what we proposed is that we utilize all of these streets that Sweetwater has and transform them into public spaces that essentially function as parks through two interventions. The transformation of residential streets into play trail streets that retain residential car access, but prioritize pedestrian mobility and dynamic motion, giving people the room to do both. And adaptive response plazas, places that are specifically designed for congregation, even in a pandemic, embedded into roundabouts throughout the intersections of play trail streets and main streets. The outcome of this is that Sweetwater could gain 79 acres of park area, doubling its amount of parks essentially, bringing it up to about 70% of the recommended park space per resident in the process. So this park and mobility network is inspired by nature theory. They encourage citizens to leave the riskier indoor environments and remain in dynamic motion through the use of nature trail elements and the intrigue that nature's constantly changing spectacles can bring to us. And this is done primarily through the use of native plants that bring seasonal foliage changes, wildlife, and different things that would keep people wanting to move on to see what else is going in their neighborhood. It's not the same every single day. Think of visiting cities like Boston or DC when the cherry blossoms are in bloom, or what other seasonal spectacles might exist in other places. And the features of these streets specifically designed to allow both dynamic motion and distancing through their physical design features. For example, using naturalistic playscape elements rather than metallic playscape elements discourages people from constantly putting their hands on one highly infectious spot. Also, these are porous materials which hold diseases like COVID-19 much less likely than metallic materials that are used for exercise and play equipment. The promotion of gardening on private property would allow people to come outside and experience their neighbors from a safe distance rather than being trapped indoors while their lawn goes unused. And pavement patterns can also be used to allow very simple, unambiguous social distancing in the 10 by 10 rule, never having greater than a 10% occupancy of a place, no more than 10 people in one area, and for no more than 10 minutes. And common sense solutions that we need for climate change, such as porous pavement and bioswales, will prevent flooding in this area, which will also make sure that people have the room to distance and remain in motion. If everything's flooded, that will not be possible.
So beyond the spectacle and experience that Florida's incredible nature has to offer, this design also promotes respiratory resilience year-round. The COVID-19 is obviously a multi-systemic disease and a respiratory disease. And the design of a built environment impacts how your pre-existing respiratory health. So we know that if you live near a highway, you're more likely to experience asthma exacerbations and COPD exacerbations. So, but if you can plant trees within 300 meters of that highway, you decrease that risk. So the planting strategy here promotes that respiratory health year round. For example, by decreasing the amount of pollen. So if you use both a combination of male and female trees, where right now most of the US only uses male trees, you can decrease some of the pollen and decrease asthma exacerbations. By designing, a canopy overhead, you can decrease heat. And for every 1 degree Celsius increase in heat, you get an 18% increase in respiratory mortality. So you can use the canopy cover to your advantage and prevent death in that way. Or if there, another area where you maybe don't want people to congregate, because of a disease like COVID-19, you can put a palm tree there instead. So you can take away the shade in certain areas just to keep people moving. Again, using the design to promote dynamic motion throughout the street. Finally, by not having one continuous canopy cover, you can ensure that you're going to have airflow with the breeze all year long, and you're not going to be accumulating any kind of infective doses of COVID-19 or accumulating particulate matter from all the exhaust from our cars.
That would be especially important for when we want to put things like pocket forests and very dense strands of trees in areas where there might be a lot of a virus or air pollution. We wouldn't want dense forest-like conditions. We deem that alternating canopy. So this is an example of the South Florida planting palette that can be used for sort of a nature trail experience on a city street. High performance native species add all of the wildlife that we mentioned, and they also have deeper roots in our native soils, which allow them to soak up more flood water and put it into the air, protecting us from floods, keeping these places more functional year-round. In places outside of South Florida, other conditions would need to be considered besides elevation for the most viable habitat. So finally, our congregation spaces, adaptive response plazas. So these are roundabout parklets that we're proposing at the intersections of our small residential nature play streets and the main streets that run through Sweetwater. If you're familiar with Sweetwater, this would be 109 Avenue, Flagler, these types of streets. So we calm traffic in these areas through multiple approaches, roundabout murals, speed tables, and bollards, creating a lot of visual friction that make cars uncomfortable speeding through these places that should be for people. If we were to create only 9 of these in Sweetwater, fitting into their existing right-of-way, we can add 1.62 acres of park space into Sweetwater.
So as you've seen, like a big theme of this project is that dynamism and adaptability. So the adaptive response plazas feature innovative components that could prevent infectious outbreaks in these congregational nodes. So in a normal year, you'll see that envisioned here on the left side of the plaza. You can have tables where people can come around and they can play dominoes or chess and checkers and be with their community. And then you can have a bulletin where you can post, job postings or, sign up for volunteer events. But in a pandemic year, that sort of flexes, and we'll take that furniture out to try to discourage that congregation, discourage the spread of a pandemic. And in its place, put something like a PPE pickup location, so people can come pick up a mask that they know is going to be safe and effective. Or there could be a community bulletin where it's like one trusted place to come through the latest CDC guidelines, rather than constantly being on your phone and not being sure what information is trustworthy or not. Additionally, the whole design of the plaza is intended with respiratory resilience and health in mind. So a UVC thermal chimney could adapt ancient technology of passive cooling to bring heat up, which will bring viral particles up with it, and then disinfect them through a UV lamp. Surfaces and handrails, where people need to touch for accessibility purposes, we can make those out of copper, because copper has been shown to have antiviral properties, and you're less likely to have a virus live on the surface than something like steel or iron. And then and it's not just for pandemic response. Really, any response where you need a hub of information, these could serve for. So in hurricane-prone Miami, it would be useful in those situations as well.
This could also provide an alternative to having to do things like go to an indoor grocery store where you don't trust that everybody will be wearing a mask. And by distributing them throughout the community, rather than make everyone go to one store, these sort of necessary pickups can have the risk seriously mitigated. And aside from being in a pandemic, this could inform the safe design of bus stops and places that people have to congregate all the time, no matter what, even in an emergency. We think that this would not only prevent things like COVID, but would help with things we have all the time, like the flu, which is spreading more in, of course, high density places. So these are simply our calculations. Very simple calculations that I learned while working at Serbia of the calculation of how to transform linear street feet into total area, which we used for our project. I just wanted to share this in case anyone else wanted to do sort of streetscape transformation project in their education or in their career. And I finally just wanted to mention that, Eric and I had a wonderful time transforming this into a written paper that we're submitting for publication currently. And the reason that I bring this up is I find that as designers, we're so gifted at sharing things graphically. And I think we forget the power of writing and reaching a large audience through our writing. You make a presentation for school, and then where does it go? It needs you to speak to sort of give life to it. So I would just encourage everybody who is interested in sort of collaborating and sharing information to be more involved in writing to get our message out there. Graphics plus writing, I think, you're unstoppable. So thank you. That's the end of our presentation. And thank you, Eric, for this collaboration. It was really an awesome time doing this, and I'm excited to see the next step of turning this into action.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a blast. I've learned a lot.
So thank you. I would now like to invite Mariana Boldu to share her screen and unmute her microphone.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. That was an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I will try to go within the time allowed for the presentation. I am here today to share with you what resilience design, a call to action for well-being, means to us in our studio. I wanted to start this presentation with this image of the climate strike last year in front of City Hall. This went on every Friday for 26 weeks until the city decided to declare climate emergency. The good news is that there are many lines of progress on what the city is doing. Since then, it has joined the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. It's working on the 305 climate strategy along with Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami, and is in the process of allocating forever bond monies for climate adaptation action and projects throughout the city. We live in a beautiful place. We all know that it's surrounded and shaped by water, and we need to celebrate it and acknowledge. It's a very complex system, very much as the puzzle you see on the screen, and together works as a whole. Everything we do, and I want to emphasize action throughout our presentation, has a cause, and that cause leads to an effect. When we talk about climate change, we use those terms as mitigation to acknowledge the causes and the impact those causes have on our environment and how we go about reducing them or drawing down the carbon. And we talked about adaptation as a way of coping with those causes that we put out there. As you see here on this puzzle, resilient design, it's right there at the core, because it's weaving both of those things that we're gonna achieve collective well-being. What collective means for us, it's all of us, it's everybody. We are all needed, and we are all needed on our superheroes capacity. Here at Curtis & Rogers, everybody is a superhero. Everybody is unique and different, and everybody brings something to the table, and we together are stronger and larger than the parts. We actually come with 5 FIU grad superheroes on our staff, and we're very proud of all of them. So you see Jenny here, Dick Rogers, who is one of the founders and taught at FIU for a couple of years. We have Ruben and Olivia and Aurora and Ralph. So they're all coming from your school, and they're wonderful to have on our staff. I just wanted to say we're at a time, and we all know this, that we need to act as our life depends on it. How we go about it here at Curtis & Rogers is we educate ourselves, so then we can go and act and educate others. We take every single opportunity. Right here you see at the bottom images of a UF Master Naturalized course that many of us took on coastal resiliency. And at the top, you see us engaging on the CLIO Institute. Many of us are CLIO certified speakers, but we also collaborate with them on the lab that they host, the climate lab they host every year. We've been doing that since 2018. And we went through many different workshops and facing this last year with the COVID pandemic, we had to do it on the web. So we had breakout rooms and we educate high school students on how green infrastructure it's a tool for adaptation and for implementing change that would lead us in a better direction. You have to step out of your comfort zone. It's sometimes you're afraid, but the only way to do it is just to dive right in. This is a privilege. It's not a privilege of senior positions such as mine or the partners. This is a culture that you have to, propose right from the beginning. So right here, I wanted to correct Robin or something. I was member of Sea Level Rise Committee for a year, and I helped transition the Sea Level Rise Committee to the Climate Resilience Committee that is today. By doing that, I kicked myself out. But I was happy to be able to contribute in that capacity so they could actually review what the city is doing. We participate on ASLA panels, and we went from Aida being right here, you see her sitting on an all-male dominated panel speaking on urban canopy, to an all-female leading panel next year unveiling climate change on ground zero. You also see Olivia Bousset here, grad of yours, and Aurora also diving into the comfort zone. So it's all of us and it's all the time. The challenges ahead are big, but there is an unprecedented opportunity for resilient design rooted in science, team collaboration, and a strategic partnership. So I will go through what it means on our studio. Rooted in science, we have an innovation lab that is part of our practice. And in there, we put the emphasis on innovation and assistance of cutting edge software, such as BEAM or LEAM, as we like to call it. So we go into modeling and testing solar radiation and getting the metrics right, and also making the case, such as using those tools right here to be advocates for what we're proposing on our projects. This is a mangrove planter underneath I-95 on Jose Marti. We also take the opportunity to collaborate with all the universities such as yours. This is us participating 2 years in a row on the Sea Solution Day, collecting data on one of our projects. And we use all those things to build the case and move our projects forward in certain directions. Team collaboration. We work with everybody, all kind of different professions, from architects to engineers, environmentalists, scientists, planners, land use attorneys, economists, artists, graphic designers. And yes, we do consider our clients part of our team, and also the stakeholders on every single project, so all of us. We also engage, the FIU Sea Level Rise Design Solutions Center many times, the Laboratory for Integrative Knowledge, the Nature Conservancy, the Audubon Society. Everybody that comes across our mind, we engage to collaborate. Sometimes we think a little bit outside of the box and do strategic partnerships. This is an image of myself on Copenhagen, of all places. We went out there to engage with Superflex for an RFP that the DDA put out there for the Miami Bay Walk. It was a wonderful experience, and as a result of that, we came up with some big ideas. This is a collective art-inspired landmark installation. That was our proposal that would celebrate the connection of Miami with the water, while at the same time creating environmental awareness of sea level rise, climate change, and the process of coral bleaching that is going on by installing these monumental landmarks along the Baywalk. We do many things. Let's talk about trees. You went in depth on some of those. This is another project we're working currently on, that it's a Southwest Streetscape Master Plan for City of Miami. And this is an area, as you can see here on the map, quite large. It's from Flagler Street on the north to US 1, Southwest 37, and 4th Avenue on the east. What is interesting here is to think about the urban canopy as an equity sort of variable, because as the heat gets higher, you can see how it relates to the property values getting lower. That is not right, because it's not equitable. And all of you know that this is very, very important, because when you're on the shade, and this is an image right here, you are 45 degrees cooler than when you are exposed to the brutal heat. And that relates to health, and it relates to vulnerability of the population that moves by walking, especially kids and seniors. In East Little Havana, just to give you a little bit of more of a grasp, the urban canopy is on the right of way. On the street, it's 8%. That is 32% below what it should be, the minimum threshold that desirable for outdoor comfort, that is 40%. And as we move forward and the heat becomes more significant, it's projected by 2030, we will have 126 days over 104 degrees, and it will move to 152 by 2050. This is an imbalance that it needs to be fixed. So this is really, really important as we go engaging into these projects, understanding the metrics. How do we go about bringing trees and nature back into the urban fabric? The project that I just showed you, which is one slide, and it's a monumental task, it's a little bit different than this one right here. This is the Naturalized Roadways. And it's there are 3 interchanges along a harsh portion of the Palmetto Expressway. So in this project, we engage FDOT District 6, our client, and Ralph Ferrer here was the project manager for that. We focus on naturalizing the interchange, and you can see here in the graphics how we can want to bring habitat back as a stepping stones that would allow the highway not only to mitigate and absorb carbon, but to also serve as a stepping stone for ecological restoration and bringing native communities back, bird habitat, pollinators back to the urban metrics. I'm not going to dive into detail into the benefits of trees, because Robert and Eric did a wonderful job covering all of these. I just wanted to highlight the stormwater management capacity that trees have into facilitating the water down to the aquifer. That is something that we need to understand, as our Biscayne aquifer is at risk at the same time. So when we talk about trees, we do everything and more. So you can see right here on the left images of the naturalized roadways and how that is coming along. And on the right, you can see how we replan on very urbanized conditions, and we make sure we think about what the trees need. Everything lies on the roots. The roots are the brain of the trees. If the roots don't have a place to live and expand and breathe, the trees will fail. So our battle is on the right of way and the streets to put the cells that are needed for the soil conditions and the roots to be able to thrive. So continuing on that, we wanted to do 3 things mainly. We retain, we recondition, and we relocate. So retaining, this is the Ransom School. We retained over 500 native trees, and we replanted a bunch more of them. And in the middle, you can see images right here at Grand Avenue and First Main Highway in Coconut Grove. We reconditioned very narrow sidewalks to be able to save existing mahogany trees. we save also many other ones along. And on the far right, this is so far in 2 year plus, we have saved over 60 major trees throughout the campus. So we, as I said, we try to do it all. So we have our trees, thrive. This is a very interesting project, the Miami Marine Stadium. You probably heard about it. Here interdisciplinary collaboration was a big thing. We worked along the initial original designer, Hilario Candela, and the architects of record, Richard Heisenbottle, and a very strong team of engineers to make that this possible. And it has a true component of adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And I will show you on the next image that everything that it's truly magnificent, it's also hidden below the surface. So everything you see here is how we raise the site 3 feet to be able to have a space for storing water and feeding the trees. And we have to work with sea level rise levels and an existing historic structure that we needed to celebrate and maintain and to keep the open views. So it was, it's currently under permitting. So construction, it's probably, I don't know, maybe six months, a year ahead. And hopefully we will get it, we will get to see it restored. Next project is Alice Winrate Park, right at the causeway going to Key Biscayne. It's a wonderful park for City of Miami. It has a natural forest community preserve within it. And we were brought along by the engineers to do some improvements along the new Bay Walk. And it turned into a huge undertaking and a wonderful project. So one of the main points was to start by removing the exotics. We had just last week removed 60 plus Australian pines. And we are, as you can see on this image, bringing in native proper vegetation that is gonna coexist with the nature forest preserve. We are retrofitting the gray infrastructure. We're raising the park to a level where we could save some of the existing trees. We're proposing pervious paving, but most importantly, we're bringing water public access to the edge on a very different qualitative condition from what you see at the top left corner of the existing conditions today. So last, I'm gonna talk very briefly about Jose Marti Park, yet another wonderful park at the Miami River and East La Habana for City of Miami. This is the first project where the city is engaging flood mitigation and adaptation and has asked us to develop a toolkit of resources to be a model for all their parks going forward. This is going to be the first park that is going to be WEDGE certified for probably South Florida. WEDGE stands for Water Edge Design Guidelines, and it's a program pretty much like LEED for coastal development. There are many wonderful things about it, and I will try to be brief so I keep within the time. So our first stage was looking at the larger area and context of the park and seeing how our toolkit could actually through time extend to other areas. And this has an extensive documentation on flooding mappings and things like that I'm not gonna share with you, but that's how we came up to these other green areas that were potentially future extensions for the park. So then I'm gonna just briefly share how we went about, protecting, collecting, and cooling and connecting. So protecting, it's about reinforcing the strength of the water edge. So we introduce a variety of things that go from 2 living shoreline planters, the south and the north, as we call them, with specific features for each one that relates to the conditions of the site. So we retrofitted some of the existing seawalls. We put higher walls on the back. We have mangrove planters that are different. Underneath the highway, we have black mangroves. On the open sun, we have reds, and how the views and the openings are a little bit different. We have viewing platforms and floating boardwalks to have 360 outdoor classrooms, as we call them. We also have a water taxi area. We have living seawalls, and just the whole stretch of tools we wanted to test. It's been, we're at one working toward 100% construction documents, and it has been wonderful and challenging in many regards. Collect the water, how we relate to the water, and how we deal with storing it and conveying it, and how everything goes from blue-green streets and exfiltration trenches that are hybrid, to bioswales, to gray blue infrastructure, as we call it, storing underneath paving, to more rain gardens and the living shoreline components. And we have extensive, work on each one of those that I'm not gonna go into further detail. Cooling, Robert and Eric talked a little bit about this. We're bringing in a swath of the larger ecosystem into the park, so we can increase biodiversity and wildlife, and we can create these wonderful opportunities, just not for us and our well-being, but the whole ecosystem. We're one with nature, and that's what we wanted to convey here on the park. So with our transect goes from mangroves to salt marshes to mark prairies to rock hammocks to a little bit of pine rockland and back. How do we connect? We connect ourselves with others by connecting to life. So this is just a very snippet about nature play on the park, and how we wanted to reconnect with the organisms within the environment, broaden the awareness, and show appreciation for all kinds of life. So we're migrating from the existing playground to a sea level rise, water play area, to a transect of limestone rivers and tequesta mounds, talking about ecology, and then into how the water edge, the coral reefs, the marsh, and the mangroves can protect us. This is about giving kids an opportunity for free play, and to be able to go through their sensory experiences and gross motor experiences for all different levels. So with that, I just wanted to come back to the beginning. These are images of the same project, and resilience design is a call to action for collective well-being. We need to be together with nature one, and it's well-being for all life forms. It's not just for us. We need to remind ourselves of that every moment. Why we need to do this? Because all of us might be superheroes. There is no planet B. So with that, I just wanted to wrap it up and continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Mariana. That was at the end. So now I'd like to please invite Alexa Von Brainerd to share her screen and share her wonderful research on Deafscape with us all.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much to FIU School of Architecture for inviting me here today. My name is Alexa, and my research as a deaf landscape designer began with a project I called Deafscape. And this actually focuses on designing public spaces specifically for the deaf and hard of hearing community. So I want to touch a little bit on the dominant paradigm of society known as the medical model of disability. And this model views this disabled person as the problem and in need of fixing. So disabled people are required to adapt themselves to the environment. And if they don't fit the mold or can't use a space, it's on them. The social model, in stark contrast, views the built environment as the problem. So disabled people should not be forced to fix themselves nor adapt to the built environment. They are seen as human beings with the right to barrier-free and adaptive spaces So we need to begin to adopt the social model of disability and to realize that our built environment is in need of adaptation and transformation, that it's in flux, it's not static. And because access to public space truly is a civil right, not a privilege. So there's much to learn about the built environment from the disabled experience, yet it's taken a pandemic for us to begin to think about very stark access issues that we're experiencing. So in this presentation, I use identity-first language to describe members of the disabled and deaf communities. Although you should always simply ask a person what they prefer, similar to asking for pronouns, disabled is not a bad word. And claiming disabled identity can actually be very empowering and a deep sense of pride to disabled community members. And I try to push that in a lot of my work. Jumping into my own identity as a deaf woman, I receive many questions about what it means exactly to be deaf and to identify this way. And I like to say that deafness is not a black and white identity, it's actually a gray area. And this is very true of all disabled identities. I like to call it a spectrum. And so every disability is like a spectrum. The deafness spectrum can actually include folks born deaf to deaf parents or hearing parents. We have hard of hearing folks who identify as deaf culturally because they use sign language. We have late deafened folks who begin identifying as deaf later in life. We have deaf blind and deaf disabled individuals who have unique cultural identities in addition to deaf culture. And we even have hearing people born to deaf parents or family known as CODA. And these are children of deaf adults. And they can enter into the spectrum because they're raised with the sign language and with deaf culture. And so the key here for deaf culture is that shared sign language along with other cultural factors. And so I actually joined the deaf community only a few years ago when I started learning American Sign Language. And prior to that, I had identified as hard of hearing since about age 8. And so my pride as a deaf person with a capital D, which indicates culture identity, grew from learning American Sign Language, as I said, and also making deaf friends who share in my identity. And so contrary to medical model thinking, deafness is not viewed as negative by the deaf community. We refrain from using negative medical community terms such as hearing loss or hearing impaired, or the archaic terms deaf and dumb. We instead focus on a concept called deaf gain because we believe we have something unique to offer the world and we pride ourselves in our identity. And so American Sign Language, or ASL, is the official sign language of the United States and English-speaking Canada. But there are also many dialects within ASL, such as Black American Sign Language, which grew on its own due in part to the fact that deaf schools were actually segregated, just like regular schools, which is really unfortunate. But in that, we had Black American Sign Language growing on its own, which is its unique language within American Sign Language. And we even have accents in some cities or regions. For an example, in Philadelphia, they have a lot of input from French Sign Language, actually. And so you'll see some like different signs and terminologies come up. So there are about 1 million deaf people using ASL as their primary language. And in my research, I do focus on the American deaf community. However, I want to make note that ASL is not universal, which is very contrary to public belief. There are actually over 300 documented sign languages globally, and there are over 70 million deaf people around the world using one or more of these sign languages. So although I'm focusing on this particular part of deaf culture, it's very diverse as well. And so despite these statistics, the ADA standards really only cover 2 accommodations for deaf and hard of hearing people. And these include flashing visual fire alarms in buildings, and then we have captioning at very large stadiums. These limitations and legal requirements have really inspired my work. And so in 2010, Gallaudet University, which is the only deaf and hard of hearing university in the world, created the Deaf Space Design Guidelines with the guidance of hearing architect Hansel Baumann. These guidelines focus on 5 sections, which illustrate ways to create spaces where deaf culture can really flourish. And so these 5 sections are space and proximity, 360-degree sensory reach. We have mobility and proximity, light and color, and acoustics and electromagnetic interference. So in 2018, I studied these principles and I wrote an article about applying them directly to the landscape. Although the guidelines, similarly to the ADA standards and other sets of guidelines that we have, apply more so to architecture and interiors, I actually discovered many ways to apply them to the greater urban landscape through the first 4 sections. I took specifically 8 principles of deaf space from those 4 sections of the guidelines and applied them graphically to an urban streetscape. So these are meant to go beyond ADA requirements to create even more space for the deaf community to use comfortably and to enjoy, as well as other disabled and non-disabled groups who serve to benefit. And they're all generally good practices, really, but they're not often fully incorporated into urban environments. And so through today's lens of COVID-19, I'm going to zoom in on 3 of these principles of deafscape, which are particularly relevant not only for the deaf community, but to everyone experiencing the pandemic today. And these are shoulder zone, flexible seating, and wider pathways. I'll also follow with an example of a project from the studio that I work with, Olin, and it's not specifically designed with deafscape in mind, but it illustrates how universal design and human-centered design is applied, and sometimes unknowingly, and then like how it serves to benefit many people, whether we are experiencing a pandemic or in normal times. And so I'm going to jump into the first one, shoulder zone. And this creates a buffer between the sidewalk and the street where people can step off the main path of circulation. Deaf folks can really benefit from this for obvious reasons, you know, with the reliance on visual communication. If we need to step off the side of a sidewalk and sign with someone. Creating shoulder zones is particularly relevant to COVID though, because providing this kind of space limits further obstructions while helping people to maintain 6 feet of distance between themselves, or to provide space to maneuver around outdoor restaurant dining, which has popped up in many places, as we know, often kind of flexibly. So keeping that in mind. And a good example is actually at Dilworth Park in Philadelphia, which recently won an ASLA Urban Design Award. And in this case, there's a textured and visual contrast between, you know, the main sidewalk and the shoulder zone off the main path. And in there we have a room to park bikes, throw away trash, and step off the sidewalk. So everything is placed away from the main path and it doesn't obstruct movement. I'm moving on now to flexible seating, which is often common sense, but it helps accommodate conversation more easily for deaf and hard of hearing folks if it's flexible, because there's more room to move around and to adjust lines of sight. So flexible seating is now obviously a must for COVID, for people to adequately social distance from strangers, while also being able to be near their social bubble or people they quarantine with. And so materials should be durable, obviously, so that they last in public spaces. An example here is actually the furnishings at Bryant Park in New York, which have really lasted the test of time. If you think about it, they're very well used. And so chairs can be moved around to accommodate different groups of people based on their needs. Zooming in lastly on wider pathways. And this concept has actually come up the most in my interviews with disabled people outside of the deaf community as well. I advocate for an absolute minimum of 10 feet on busy urban sidewalks and a minimum of 6 to 8 feet in less trafficked areas. But this really provides space to move and for deaf folks to communicate with each other, as well as for wheelchair users, blind folks, and neurodivergent folks to feel more comfortable in public spaces. And so with COVID now, obviously, again, the need for 6 feet is prevalent to have space between people while walking. So maybe we want to increase that space past 10 feet to even like 12 or 14 feet for really busy sidewalks, which I wouldn't be opposed to. And, you know, you also think about the huge increase in deliveries being made, restaurants popping up, the cyclists, the scooters. So it's very important to make space count. An example here of a really wide sidewalk is at Columbus Circle in New York. And so both sides along the bollards are very wide and they provide a space for a range of users to move safely. And so as designers, we really need to begin to realize that it's our social responsibility to treat access to public space as a right, not a privilege. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the panel, but really when we consciously choose to include disabled people in our definition of diversity and in our designs, we choose to create a better world. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful. And something that I see in everyone speaking today is how much of these solutions just appear so much as common sense once you ask the people that are affected by your design. Just reaching out and talking to other people, it just makes everything start to make sense so much more. So on that, I'd like to transition into our panel. I have 3 themes that I'm going to be asking you questions about, and I have a question directed at each of you, but I would encourage you all to chime in if you'd like to participate in someone else's question as well. So our first theme is the role of community participation in designing for collective well-being. So outside of our typical designer bubble and in the communities of the people that we're serving. My question for you, Alexa, is specifically about being a deaf community member now in the industry of design, not just engaging with you as a community member, sort of as the public space user. So I think a lot of people would say that a designer's typical experience engaging with the needs of people with disabilities is just following ADA guidelines for slopes, handrails, and things like this that you mentioned. It's not so much engagement as it is following regulation. So the experience of diversely disabled people, it's not typically considered as a fundamental part of a space's design from its inception. It's kind of an engineered thing put in at the end. So I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, how do you see diversity and inclusion in the field of landscape architecture and really all the design fields affecting how designers view disability in their design process?
Definitely, that's a great question. So I feel, for a very long time that designers have not been including disability in their definition of diversity. And in reality, the disabled population is actually the largest and the most intersectional minority group globally. So as of 2011, there's over 1 billion folks globally with some sort of disability, whether it be physical, sensory, neurocognitive, or mental. And so anyone can join this group at any time. And you can be of any race, ethnicity, sex, gender, age, religion, whatever it might be. So I think as more landscape architects realize that there's, this sheer amount of people being affected by inaccessibility in the built environment, there will be more and more of like a shift in thinking about disability from the medical model to a more social worldview, because it really is such a social identity. And so similarly to how BIPOC communities have been affected by white dominant design practices, disabled community members have been affected the same way, but by ableist design thinking. And so this is not to say, of course, that the disabled community doesn't benefit from white supremacy. The face of the disabled community, myself included, is still predominantly white, which also needs to shift more to BIPOC communities. But there are so many positive benefits to be reaped from including the disabled community in the design process due to that, very diversity that I'm talking about right now within its own community. And so that's why I tend to push universal design principles as a creative tool for implementing access beyond the ADA. In general, though, I think there's a lot of discourse about health and medical spaces that pop up in these conversations, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, Robert. It obviously focuses on the health and well-being of the disabled community, but there's still that dominant medical view, as I mentioned, of disabled people needing to be fixed or cured, and also that they, or rather we, belong predominantly in medical facilities and hospitals. And so that's where people think universal design is being applied, and that's obviously like enough for the disabled community, but it's not really, right? And so it's been my personal goal to really change that kind of thinking and to begin to shift from this idea that disabled people are confined to those medical and therapeutic landscapes that we tend to have in mind, and to take those accessible design elements out of those medical spaces and into the general public realm where everyone can enjoy them, right? And so when I bring this up in conversation with non-disabled folks, I feel like they tend to begin to realize that they're limiting the disabled experience to that very small part of society, one that most disabled folks don't actually experience day to day. And then of course I get a lot of agreement from disabled folks that are like, oh yeah, like I'm always thought to be in a hospital 24/7, which, there are a lot of chronically ill folks out there that do need to be in the hospital a lot, but just thinking about everyday spaces, I think it's starting to grow just by having these conversations. So
that's wonderful. I remember from our conversation at Cut and Fill, people discussing that when they made these medical spaces, they would often partner with an occupational therapist, other people who are familiar with these things. But like you're saying, they need to go into public space practice. So as more diverse designers create projects like Deafscape, or more of these medical spaces informed by people like therapists are created, how do you envision that future designers are going to access this knowledge and put it into practice? Because it's not currently being transformed to sort of a new ADA guideline. How do you see that changing in the future?
Right. So I think currently, as I kind of mentioned, that universal design is a human-centered design practice too, like Deafscape. And so accessibility in general, it's not really treated like common sense, which many people are shocked to find. It may be in theory. I think that folks think it's a no-brainer to apply accessible design principles or universal design practices to each project, but it's not actually happening at a large scale right now. It's often seen as an extra work, as you mentioned, or like extra expense. And designers literally grumble about the ADA. I have people tell me how much they hate having to apply the ADA standards, right? But in reality, it's really a huge, long-lasting benefit and an investment in our futures and our communities. And I think it shows that we really care about the disabled community's well-being and their use of public space. So I think over time, more and more disabled folks across the spectrum of disabled identity will begin to realize, that we've so much lived experience and expertise to contribute to society and the design professions. And so more and more will become designers, at least that's my hope, and they'll begin to share their knowledge and creating a more accessible public realm, because we're so used to, fixing things ourselves or adapting ourselves. And I think it's high time that the built environment and designers start to do that for us. And so as more of us step forward and begin to share our stories and that pride that we have in our identity, as well as, like I said, the collective frustration with the built environment and its long-lasting medical model worldview, many more non-disabled designers and planners are going to start becoming more aware of what's lacking in the built environment and like what needs to be done to make it more inclusive. So I think it really comes down to, having engagements and conversations, as well as inviting specifically like disabled stakeholders and experts to the table to really become aware of what needs to be done. And so I think many designers in our generation in particular are really open and aware to the needs of different communities, whether it be BIPOC communities, disabled communities. And so I think that's really a huge benefit. And like, I can really tangibly feel that passion that comes up with the younger generations, even younger than us. And so I think, once that starts to be implemented at a larger scale, I think there's just going to be that shared desire to create a better world that obviously implements all the new knowledge coming in that's gathered by all the communities being impacted by outdated design methods, whatever they might be. And there's that like willingness to really just go and improve the practices by incorporating firsthand knowledge, right, and experience. And that's really what this comes down to, is just taking the time to listen to what people different from you need, right, and not patronizing them, not making this like a charity project, but really listening and wanting to fix the problems, right? And that's the whole switch to the social model. So I could talk about this for days. So I'm going to let you ask the next question.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you. And it's exciting to see now that this is already sort of affecting education with FIU having us here today. So that's awesome. I'd love to see a future where these things are taught in theory and things, not just as regulations, but fundamental design theory. So my next question is for Mariana. So you're a landscape architect focused on resilient design, and you have such an amazing breadth of experience and expertise, and you use it to serve as an advocate for the people. You protect the public from heat, sea level, flood-borne diseases like Zika that come from mosquitoes. So my question is, when you bring all this expertise into a community that already has a specific culture, it has economic needs outside of the climate crisis, what are the greatest opportunities and the challenges of balancing all of these sort of technical things that need to change, but with the cultural and economic things going on in this community already?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I'm going to touch into a very experience-related answer to what you posed here, and that was our community outreach through the Jose Marti project. There we are engaging, a low-income community that it's a majority Spanish speakers. So going to what Alexa was saying, it's not only about disabilities, but the different levels of ability sometimes, a person that just goes about doing things a little bit different than what we're used to. So the opportunities are tremendous, because once you actually take the time to have a conversation, and understanding where they're at, then you can exchange and you can work together. So in there, we engage them several times right at the beginning. Before the pandemic was a little bit easier because it was person to person. It was more approachable to have these, human connections. And then we can see that, they understand what they are facing. They see the seas are rising because they experience king tide on the park every year, and every year it comes higher. So having a conversation with them is not as difficult as you might think once you have it at a level that you can communicate. I guess that's the point, establishing a back and forth dialogue. And then it's a wonderful opportunity to get informed, because they have a lot of knowledge you wouldn't have, because you're not, a user of the project as they are on an often basis. And then you have the opportunity to educate them and why you're heading the direction you're heading with the project, and how it's a, it's a street that goes both ways. You work together on that. So that's the opportunity. The challenges are many at the same time. Once we were faced with the pandemic, we have to go through a web-based platforms for the outreach, and engaging. Even though we tried our best, we translated everything to Spanish. We did bilingual presentations. Yet it's a kind of segment that is not used to dealing with the computer platform, so it's not their comfort zone. So that's where you face the challenges, but you're put in this situation. You have to work with what you have and try to provide a place where they can still could keep giving feedback. At the same time, the challenges are not only with the community, the education goes at all levels. So you educate yourself as you engage, but it's the outreach with the stakeholders. It's also the client, on these engagements, you also educate your clients. So it's all the time. It's wonderful.
Well, that's awesome. I can only imagine too the future opportunities that will bring expertise that we can do things digital in the future, the ability to reach people that we wouldn't have been able to reach before. So Eric, my third question in this topic is for you. So we know there's this great deal of scientific evidence that shows that representation in healthcare practice increases patient outcomes. For example, having more Black doctors increases the chance that women will survive childbirth and that infants will survive. And likewise, there's a great deal of evidence that shows that adapting medical practice to reflect local cultural healing practices affects public health outcomes. So do you think medical practitioners and other professionals operating on technical expertise, and this I think includes all designers, have an ethical obligation to adapt their practices to meet the cultures of the communities they're serving in?
1 second, I'm jotting that down. Okay. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and you brought up so many really good points there. I'd like to start with that. Obviously, I'm answering this question as like a cis white man, queer and Jewish, but fit right in with that traditional, that medical model. So there's obviously going to be, I'm coming at it from that lens. It's going to be very different from someone who has experience in the healthcare system as a Black or Indigenous person of color, or as a disabled person, whatever it may be. But as far as the cultural practices go, I mean, absolutely, you should always like adapt your practice to the cultural practice of whoever you are treating. But beyond that, you should develop your practices with the people specifically. If you're adapting your practice, you're still saying my model is right, and I'm gonna allow you to have your cute practice. It still kind of can have that paternalistic and condescending view if you're like adapting what you do, versus if you start from the ground up and you say, I'm going to like, I have this knowledge and expertise. You have your knowledge and expertise. How can we merge those? Similar to like you and I working together on the Beyond the Distance project. I think that will create a much more sustainable method of care that people will be more willing to adhere to and be more willing to like come back and say, oh, this isn't working, we need to modify it. And that's similar to, it kind of goes back to your question about representation in healthcare. So obviously policing and healthcare are two very different issues, but just having representation in policing doesn't fix some of the fundamental problems of policing. Same thing with healthcare. Just having representation in healthcare isn't going to fix those fundamental problems that like healthcare is 18% of our total GDP and no one can afford it. It's the expensive healthcare in the world, and it gives us the worst outcomes. So representation is very important because, you know, you're like those same issues I was talking about earlier. You're going to be more likely to follow the advice of someone you know and trust. And when you're coming from that same cultural lens, you're going to inherently be creating a care plan that the patient's going to feel okay with following. So representation is sort of, representation in my mind can improve the outcomes through those one-on-one interactions, but not through the whole systemic change that really needs to happen.
I could really see then too how if it's best to have sort of design practices, medical practices, technical practices made with communities from the beginning, just how important it is to really have sort of a well-rounded education on the part of these practitioners, you know, to have designers who can speak the language of science, but also ethics and these sorts of things that we hope that people will gain in university, but often things are in STEM are reduced down to just STEM. I think sort of the resurgence of STEAM now, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, including liberal arts, philosophy, and these things. I hope that that reintroduction back into education and that refocus that we see can really help to make that happen, to make that have an opportunity for us to speak the same language.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that kind of comes down to humility. And a lot of the medical model is the approachment of everything I say is like gold fact because it's based on science. And it's like a cultural worshiping of science, which like science is obviously a really valuable tool. The scientific method and of like saying like, does this intervention work or not is incredibly valuable. And I have like a deep ethical obligation to follow the scientific method to be sure I'm not prescribing treatments that are harmful or that do not work. But it is at the end of the day a cultural belief that the only things that matter are what I can prove. And if you are disregarding, well, this is my cultural belief that this matters to me, well, I can't prove that it matters. So I'm going to ignore you because I can't prove it. So I think by approaching it again with that kind of humility to like things, matters of the spirit, like you were talking about with like the STEAM careers, the arts, bringing that back into healthcare, bringing a touch of humility, I think could go a long way though.
Awesome, thank you. The next questions that I'd like to ask are about building strategic partnerships in order to achieve collective well-being. So my first question is for you, Mariana. So you really showed how much interdisciplinary collaboration that you've done and Curtis and Rogers has done with economics, environmental planning, engineering, architecture, landscape architecture. So I'd like to ask, how do smaller landscape architecture studios go about building teams for these kind of projects? Where does that fit into the RFP process that we've all sort of learned about? When do you build a team? How do you adapt a team?
A great question. I guess that might have different answers depending on how the opportunity comes along. You know, many times when we are the ones putting the teams together and we are the lead on the project, then we think about what would be the best fit for what is needed to happen. And we rely a lot of relationships we have built over the years. So we know people we work well with, that we're very effective, that we communicate very seamlessly, and they align with the same core values and are able and willing to go the extra mile we always put in on what we do. So that's one scenario. many other times we are reached out by other teams to be a sub to their led team. And that composition, you might not have that much input, but yet again, they come to you because you probably have worked with them on the past, or they have been referred by someone that had a good positive experience working with you. But I guess to your point of the strategic partnership, I want to think about that more as of everybody that you engage with, it becomes a strategic partner of some sort at one time or another. So it's about what Eric was saying and what Alexa was saying. It's about building that human connection with the other and understanding the other person. And there is always, by having those engagements, you realize what the other one can bring to the table. So that's the way we build our strategic, collaborations, by engaging human beings and realizing their potential as well as yours, and how the two of them would benefit the most.
So when you're working on a project like Jose Marti Park, when you approach the city or county, whoever is sort of in charge of this, are you in the initial steps proposing a project that you've conceived, or are you proposing an approach?
The RFPs outline what it needs to be done and the sort of resources they see as needed. But then, you go into your own process and trying to go further into understanding what the issues are, what would be the best association, how you would bring it along, and you start having conversations with these peoples and start crafting your team. Many times you put a team together, and by the end of a project getting awarded and the negotiation, that get shaken a little bit, because it's not an easy process to go through, and it's sometimes very challenging, and resources are limited. So maybe you started with one vision and you ended up with part and pieces of that vision, but it's still to meet the client of the need of the client, I guess. So that's kind of
awesome.
Does that answer your question? It
does, thank you.
Okay.
My last question in this topic is then, excuse me, two more. This one is for Eric. So the World Health Organization defines community health as the environmental, social, and economic resources to sustain emotional and physical well-being among people in ways that advance their aspirations and satisfy their needs in their unique environment. So as you've shown in the research that you've done with me, this is something that landscape architects, urban designers, interior architects, building architects, all have the opportunity to provide these resources, but they might not know how to on their own. So as someone who's worked in such a different breadth of interdisciplinary projects involving human trafficking, policing, maternal mortality, pandemics, how do you envision people in the future engaging people from other disciplines in the way that you so frequently do? Is it just the social interactions that you maintain? Is it things you do through clubs? Is it through professional networking?
That is a really tough question. And I guess for me personally, it's always been through social interactions. Like I personally just really value my social, like my relationships with others are just the most important thing to me. And if I think of what's been most impactful in my life, it is my friendships. And that extends to my professional work. Like a lot of the, like I have collaborations with UM, with you, with Nova, with Boston Medical Center, and all of these are, at the end of the day, like rooted in friendship for me. But I don't know if that's necessarily like a sustainable plan to, change the world. So I guess going back to your quote about have community health and about community health being people in their own environment, in their own social context, the medical model largely ignores that, right? It's like they're expected, you come to me, I will see you in my office, and I will never see you in your own home. And you will listen to like my treatments and what I have to say, and then you'll go home, and if you don't listen, that's your fault. That's actually what I like a lot about FIU's medical school, is they sent us the neighborhood health program as we do home visits with people in the community, and we do interdisciplinary home visits with nursing students and social worker students. So we see people in the context of their own home. So we see, oh, why is it that you can't change your diet around diabetes? Or why is it that you keep repeatedly falling in your home and breaking a hip? I think that is an example of a really sustainable way to incorporate interdisciplinary teams into the future, just by putting it in the education of how people are trained. And then as far as Boston Medical Center actually had the first medical legal partnership where there was one ER doctor who kept seeing asthma exacerbation admissions from the exact same zip codes and kids in the same buildings. And it was because the landlords refuse to do things like, but they had tons of cockroaches, and the landlords wouldn't do the pest control. They want to change the windows. So all winter long, they were being exposed to cold, dry air and getting asthma exacerbations. So this one doctor at BMC reached out to some human rights lawyers, and then they sued the landlords and got them to actually fix them. If you can have those types of partnerships with landscape architects, for example, well, I keep seeing the kids from my neighborhood who live right next to this highway keep coming in with asthma exacerbations just the same. So why can't I partner with a lawyer and a landscape architect to sue the city to put in a park or like, a tree barrier right next to this highway as like a human rights issue? I'm not sure if that answered your question, but.
It does, and I really love that FIU's School of Medicine does that in sort of an experiential education setting. It's not abstract. I think just by having to actually do that with a real person in a real home, you're forced to sort of confront what really works, not what you think works. And I think that's so relevant to design, where we can say all day what we think is going to work and write all about it, but if nobody's doing it, you can't prove it. So yeah, thank you. That absolutely does. And finally, Alexa. So you mentioned how you're actively involved in ASLA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion board, and you're an LAF Olmsted Fellow with your Deafscape research and creating greater disability research. So how have these outreach experiences helped you to build strategic teams and turn them into greater expertise widespread in the practice?
There we go. So I think that with, the team building, I haven't built like a distinctive permanent team, but just being able to connect with other disabled designers and just disabled folks in general that have any type of passion about access has really been like the ultimate gift for me, because, it's just that shared experience, even if it's slightly different, and like being able to share stories and just the pride in our community in that way is really validating. And I think, you and I kind of experience that, even though we have such different identities, right? But it's just sharing that conversation and sharing those thoughts is really empowering. And so I think, in order to really bring it into widespread practice, it's about just coming to that like collective understanding and working towards the same goals collectively is really going to start to dismantle barriers that we experience, right? And so again, like, although I haven't built those distinct teams of disabled folks, it's really that networking, I think, that counts, because there's potential, for future collaborations or research or practice, whatever it might be. And I think over time that will obviously, the research and the work will become more collectively shared knowledge over time with non-disabled folks as well. And so I want to take this moment, to encourage all the students and practitioners here who are attending to begin to really try to network with folks who share your cultural identity, and anyone who might share in that collective struggle towards building more inclusiveness in the public realm, because those people really share your passions, and your lived experience. And I think it's really such a powerful driving tool that will help you continue to create change in your own research and your own practice. So really grasp onto that and let it drive your work. And I think, with me, with working with Olin, even though I haven't built a specific disabled team in my firm, there have been opportunities to continue to, implement my research and practice, which has been a really great opportunity that I'm grateful to Olin for. And I think with one of the projects that we worked on in Eugene, Oregon, it's a small public town square. We actually had a specific disabled stakeholder meeting right before COVID hit, which was such a great experience. And, that's not common practice today, because I think a lot of non-disabled designers don't know where to start, or they don't feel comfortable with reaching out to disabled folks specifically. But I think, you know, breaching that comfort zone and starting to connect with different organizations or even government agencies that have connections to disabled folks, like, really can help to bring that much needed perspective into the conversation, right? And that's how you can start to build, you know, teams for each of the projects that you work on.
I remember in the cut and fill conference that we went to, they had sort of this structured way of speaking, their open space concept that had sort of these rules of mutual respect for everyone that you're speaking with in this room. And I think that's what sort of led to such great networking and conversations there, that people felt comfortable saying things that they would not feel comfortable saying in an office, but because they were assured of this sort of mutual respect from the beginning,
right, yeah,
I think people were so open.
Sharing, you know, like, yeah, exactly. And so I think it's really bringing in, like, if you can bring a group of disabled people and they become comfortable because they have each other to share that shared experience with. And I just think, you know, once you get people in the room, they won't stop talking. Like, you will get the information that you need, you know, it will come out collectively. So
thank you. I have one last question that is the same question for all three panelists. So with both the climate crisis and COVID-19, we see that this need for this rapid, large-scale change of the built environment, something at a pace that hasn't been done in a very long time. So a lot of people have called this moment of reflection a chance to sort of reset our way of being. What do you guys think are the positive opportunities to improve human well-being with creating changes at such a large scale? But conversely, what steps do you think need to be taken to protect people who are already marginalized by planning and by design, moving forward in these large scale changes, so we don't bring about and bake into our new built environment the same inequalities that we have today? I'll ask any of you to chime in whenever you're comfortable.
I'll go. So I guess I would like to answer the first portion of your question. You talk about positive opportunities. And I think the reality of where we're at as a you know, society and a world brings a unique point in time where we can use our maximum power. And what do I mean by that? It's not only the superhero aspect, but also understanding that we need to retrofit and take care of all the systems that support us, so that if we go there into the future with that understanding, I think there is an enormous potential to reverse the course of where we're going and achieve collective well-being. So that's that would be my first portion of to your answer. And I guess as far as what steps need to be taken, so there is no marginalized people left in the process. I think that it has three tiers for me. One, it's education. So we need to educate ourselves, and we need to educate everybody we engage at all levels. Then policy making. You know, the only way to protect those vulnerable sectors of the population is to put policy in place. And I guess third, but as important as the other two, it's keeping our governments accountable all the time and at all levels. And that takes action, very driven and specific from all of us. You know, get involved, get out there, speak up your mind, speak for the ones that they don't have a voice. Absolutely.
Thank you. That's an awesome feedback.
I can answer that next too. And I think, you know, from the vulnerable population side, I think on one side of the equation, it's unfortunate that it's taken a global pandemic, you know, to begin to think about access. But I feel like the positive side is just that, you know, non-disabled people have begun to really think about how much it needs to be improved, right? Like how much more we need to think about it. Because I saw recently on Instagram that the world Googled the term invisible disability. twice as much in 2020 than in 2019, right? So that's actually pretty huge because, you know, people are obviously becoming more aware of, you know, the fact that like wearing masks and social distancing and quarantining have had very like different impacts on disabled people, right? Like for me, like masks have been a huge problem because I can't lip read if someone's wearing a mask. And so it forces people to either write things down for me or use captioning app or something, right? And so I think just the fact that it's opening non-disabled people's minds about those implications for access in both technology and in the built environment is a positive opportunity in itself, right? Just because they begin to like put a face or like an experience that they see to a disabled identity, right? And so they begin to open their mind to like what's needed or what's lacking and like what's going on in society or in the built environment. And so that includes also like, you know, space on public sidewalks, like I was saying, or like alternative modes of communication. And so all of these things can really enhance the disabled experience over time if they're being noticed. So I think that's really important. And then I think the second question was about, it was like steps to take, right? And I think really it's kind of what I said before, but I think the priority should really be to include marginalized members of society at the table, like always from the start, whether it be with, you know, formal community engagements or virtual stakeholder meetings or auditing, like whatever it might be. And so I think including those voices, like first and foremost, to make sure that those voices aren't being repressed and their needs in the built environment are being met is of utmost importance, because otherwise, you know, we're just going to continue to repeat bad practices, which is obviously not what we want for our future. And so, yeah, I really think we just need to begin to highlight those marginalized voices in the design process, including disabled voices, and just make it that priority to make it happen. And, you know, it takes time to, you know, step out of the comfort zone again and to outreach to these communities, because there's often a lack of trust or a lack of comfort for these communities as well to work with people like us, because they've been so disenfranchised, right? But we have to just be really open to that process and open to also like critique in the conversations. And that means like at the beginning of a project all the way to like after being finished, because like even if we finish a project, it might need further critique, right? Like there might be something that we messed up and we might not be apparent to us, but it could drastically impact someone's use of a space. So I think it's just that openness that's really important. So
that reminds me so much about what Eric was saying about meeting people in their community to find out what is going on with them, rather than sort of the typical town hall or very exclusionary things that usually are done to get public input for a lot of things. I read this quote yesterday that was something like, you know, we want to give more people seats at the table, but what happens when that table is upstairs and you're in a wheelchair? So just, exactly. We don't need the table.
That's a huge thing too, like making your engagements accessible is really the first step. Like if you're doing general engagements, general stakeholder meetings, like there are many times where I've not been able to fully participate in something because there's no captioning, right? Or whatever it might be. And so that's the first step. And then I like to say the second step is, you know, doing specific focus group meetings for these specific groups of people that you're working with. So yeah, that's a great point, Robin.
Awesome, thank you.
One of the things I thought of was when Alexa said earlier that like the disabled community is the largest community and most diverse community in the world, and that anyone can join it tomorrow. I think that was a big piece around this pandemic, is that, you know, the long haul or COVID, like the long haul COVID syndromes, like people are like chronically fatigued for months. And there are like many disabled people with chronic fatigue syndrome that have always just been written off as being like lazy or depressed or crazy. And now suddenly there are all of these just like, oh, like quote unquote, previously normal people who are now experiencing, you know, a chronic fatigue type disability. And I think across the board, again, awful that it's taken something so drastic with, I think we crossed 400,000 deaths today. But across the board, like people like losing their jobs who never would, that could never happen to me because I'm not one of them. or losing their health insurance and now suddenly being in debt, and the massive foreclosure crisis that we're seeing across the country. I think one of the biggest opportunities are those moments for empathy now, that there's nothing inherently wrong with people who don't have health insurance or who have disabilities or who have chronic diseases and can't afford their medications. It's actually the system. And I think this moment creates a massive amount of empathy, and that empathy could potentially power forward all of the changes that I'm sure everyone on this call wants to see in terms of how our communities are built and our healthcare and education are provided. As far as your question about not using the master's tools to rebuild the house, I definitely, Mariana's point about education is so absolutely vital. Education and healthcare, you can't do anything without those two. You can't get educated if you aren't healthy, and you can't get healthy if you don't have education. It's a drastic cycle. So I think that's absolutely essential, and particularly with youth empowerment, because the youth today are the most, one, obviously for the future, but they're Alex mentioned this earlier, they are so progressive, and they just they get it in a way that a lot of other people don't, or that it hasn't seemed to have been gotten in generations past. So I think youth empowerment and bringing youth voices back into policy, back into design is absolutely critical.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We have a little less than 20 minutes left. I see 2 questions here. If anyone else would like to add in there, I'm going to start asking them now. The first question is, how do we help people become aware of things that people don't think exist as a result of their life and culture looking different than another, in small and large scale? When I first read this, I was just really thinking about how vital civic space is. Getting off of social media, which shows you things that, the way social media works is it shows you things that confirm your bias. They know you're going to click it. That's what they give you. They're not giving you anything new or that contradicts anything that you think. It doesn't function the same way that talking to a stranger in the park does. I think things as simple as just engaging with people in the public does that. And I think it's a great challenge in American society that is so focused around the car. It's unsafe to walk. It's because of all these things that come from our sort of domination of the car environment, the heat, the flooding, all of these things that literally stop us from getting to one another in the way that you might be able to in other cities. I don't know if anyone else has a perspective on that.
I think a lot of, changing perspective comes from reading about materials and resources that are written by people that actually experience the things that you're seeking information about, right? So with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, for example, I'm not gonna go read a paper that a white person writes about the Black experience, right? I'm gonna go look for someone that has lived that experience and learn from what they have to say. And so I think that's a really important part of what Robert was saying about social media, is that a lot of the things you see on social media or on the news, for example, that's someone's outsider perspective, right, about what's going on. And so I think that's what's really misleading. And so coming to that better understanding of and better awareness of what people are experiencing is really taking the time to seek out the right resources. And so that's actually something I'm working on now a little bit with my fellowship, is, creating a disabled resource that has resources made by and for disabled people, right? Instead of having all these non-disabled resources on the website. And so I think that's a big step, is just actively seeking out those materials. And, a lot of this comes down to self-education and having the desire to grow your mind on other people's experiences, because it comes down to, what individuals think, and having those resources chosen. So that's what I would say about that.
I would like to add to all of that, which are wonderful points. Dialogue, dialogue is underrated, and engaging the other person, understanding why they're not understanding what you're trying to convey or why they have a different point of view. You would be surprised on how much that interchange can enrich you, because you go there most of time thinking you have something to give, but you're gonna walk out with something the other person gives you. So engaging, I think it's fundamental portion of it too. And I know these are very challenging times for that, but I think that it's why it's so relevant that public spaces actually, offer the right, accessible, equitable place for those engagements to happen. And that's, important for us as designers and placemaking people.
I like to think too that a lot of the people that we might think of as hateful are also, they, like Alexa was saying, they don't have firsthand experience with somebody of a certain experience. Everything is just based off of their perception from something they read by someone else. And like you're saying, Mariana, I think the moment people talk in a public space, it changes everything. It's a real person, and they're not going to punch that person in the face the same way that they would say something bad on the internet. I think bringing that back is so important. One other question that we have in here, Eric mentioned how being inclusive with marginalized communities, specifically Black people in the medical field, will not resolve the larger issue of the effects of systemic racism and how how it still affects the Black community in terms of lower levels of access to medical treatment, discrimination, and etc. So what would essentially be initiatives needed to dismantle the larger issue at hand, especially through an architectural lens?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to the architectural lens, and that's why I work with Robert. But for me, when I think about these issues, I'm like, well, approach it in the exact same manner that the medical model likes to approach other problems, with basically the scientific method and transparency about that method. So right now, you should go try to look up or Jackson or Baptist health outcomes broken down by race and socioeconomic status. Never. It is nowhere to be found for anywhere. And there was for cystic fibrosis treatment centers, for the very first time, I think this was back in the 80s or 90s, they started actually looking at outcomes of cystic fibrosis. And Cleveland Clinic in Ohio was supposed to be, the best of the best. And when they actually looked at their outcomes, it was dead average. What they did is they published these openly to their patients. And they were like, we're dead average on outcomes. If you want to leave, you can, we completely understand. But these were they're very close, the physician and families, with chronic disease that, they become very close. And not a single family left, because it was rooted in mutual respect, love for the patients and the person, and transparency. So when I think about systemic racism in healthcare, I think you could approach it in a very similar manner, that if it is generally rooted in mutual respect and love, then you can say, this is the problem we're having, these are the outcome disparities we're having, and we need help, and we will pay you. Never make people work for free. We will pay you to help us fix it.
That makes quite a bit of sense. I could totally see how that applies through an architectural lens with things like the Landscape Performance Series by the Landscape Architecture Foundation. So, a lot of the things we talk about is, my design will do this, my design will take up this much flood water, or this will bring about increased social interaction. But things like post-occupancy studies, where people go in like scientists and investigate after, is this actually doing what you're saying it's doing? Is it really helping the people you're saying it's helping? And making, I'm not sure how this would be, an opportunity to go back and change things as we learn about them is really important. And sort of to readapt our parks and public spaces once we know better from these sort of post-occupancy scientific studies, or hearing from disabled people saying, actually, I was very lost in your park. I didn't feel safe there. And just, I think everybody touched on today that humility to listen and go back plays into that. We don't know what the outcome will look like yet.
I wanted to say, I agree. I think post-occupancy evaluations are very underrated and not used enough. And I think that, any project that is at least 75% public, open to the public, should be having post-occupancy evaluation after construction, every time, just because, even if there's not a lot of budget to make a lot of improvement, I mean, there's just that knowing and that research that can be accumulated so that at least with, the next project, like maybe you refrain from making the same mistakes later, and it really shows the community that, you're listening. And like Eric said as well, it's just so important to show that care, and that willingness to learn from mistakes, even if they're like seemingly minor mistakes. I think it puts a message out there that you do care about people's thoughts, about the public realm that they use every day. So
I think building up on all of that, I think monitoring, post-occupancy monitoring and collaboration with universities for all professionals that are out there practicing, it should be something that we should all promote and have in mind. There are some programs such as the WEDGE that mandates for some of the credits to go that route, to post-monitoring your improvements to see exactly how they perform, because as you said, we go there willingly thinking that we're gonna make these X improvements, but how do we really know, and how do we do it better next time if we don't actually assess it after we're done and learn the lessons from how it evolves? It's there. So I think that's a great point. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Do any of you panelists have anything else that you'd like to add that you wanted to speak about today? I'm gonna put you on the spot. And we do have one more question after you speak.
I just would like to say to all of you that this is a wonderful platform to engage in dialogue and to learn from each other and to be able to progress our understanding of the complex reality we faced. I will encourage all of you to keep on doing that and take specific actions, be a doer. We are at a time where we just cannot sit on the side anymore. This is a matter of all of us being able to collective be well, or collective just not be well. So you have to be either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. You have to pick a side.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how much all of this has to do with sort of our status as such a young nation. It's so normal to go to older civilizations and see, this building used to be this, and then we turned it into that, and now it's a park, and then it's a hospital. We're gonna cut a hole out of it and make this. And I think we worship so much on sort of starchitects, landscape architects, that people are like, we can't touch that. But like you said, that Mariana, you consider the client part of the team, and likewise the user of public space could be considered the client. And if they're not satisfied, we should change. We should not be so caught up in sort of a black and white preservationism, if that's the right term. We have one more question here from Alan. With so many contemporary initiatives focused on measures to combat COVID-19, what do you think are the most promising ones that will still be relevant in post-pandemic era? As an extension, what disability design best practices are being adopted and used by able-bodied folks? For example, the shoulder areas off sidewalks is great for everyone. I think such a large one will be sort of, many cities are going to be keeping the parklets, the streets that they changed over to be for diners and things. And I think everybody, regardless of if you're disabled or not, has seen the great value that has. That is my opinion.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And with me, I try to make it a point that with accessible design, obviously the main goal is to remove barriers to public space, right? So like you want to make the goal disabled people and their use of public space becoming better. But I think a lot of the time, in order to push the ADA or to push universal design principles, we have to illustrate, like all of these positive gains that non-disabled people will also benefit from, just to get it to happen at a broader scale, right? Because I mean, if someone's like, oh, this isn't going to benefit me at all, then like I don't care about it, right? So that's a good note to say, though, because I do agree that, a lot of I would say all of the Deafscape principles actually serve to benefit all sorts of non-disabled and other disabled groups as well. And so that's something that I try to bring up in conversation, just to sort of make non-disabled people realize that, like, hey, like, you serve to benefit from this too, because a lot of it is really, it's good design practice in general. You know, like, universal design is a very broad set of principles that aren't as technically specific as the ADA, and so I like to see it as this, like, creative tool that we can use to go beyond those bare minimum requirements that the ADA has. And again, like, when you start to apply them with different projects, different scales, I think a lot of people will really see and feel that benefit that comes with it, because it's not a one size fits all approach, but I like to say it's like a one size fits most approach, just because lots of benefits to come from it.
Well, thank you. If there's no further questions, I would just like to take this chance to thank everybody again for participating, Mariana, Eric, and Alexa. But I would also like to thank Roberto, Diana, and Mara for putting all of this together and organizing this great lecture series and going to such great lengths to making it open source and live stream so that this can reach as many people as possible, and we're not just sort of keeping these conversations to ourselves. So thank you all so much, and I guess we gotta let everybody get to class now. So yeah, well, have a good day. Thank you.
Yeah.
You guys.
It was such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.